Do you know that Chinua Achebe, one of the greatest writers of all time, never won a Nobel Prize, and he didn't even care? While the world saw him as Africa's literary giant, critics wondered why the Nobel Committee never recognized him. But Achebe had his own views, and trust me, they were bold. Today, we dive into why he never won, why it didn't bother him, and what this says about true literary greatness. Before we dive into the topic, let's rewind a bit. Who was this literary icon beyond the accolades? Born in 1930 in Ogidi, Nigeria, Achebe grew up in a time when colonial rule was shaping African identity. But young Achebe, he wasn't buying into the whole Africa had no history narrative. While other kids were playing, he was devouring books, everything from Shakespeare to African folklore. He later attended the prestigious University College Ibadan, where he fell in love with storytelling and set out on a mission to tell Africa's story through African eyes. At 28 years old, Chinua Achebe published Things Fall Apart in 1958, a novel that would go on to sell over 20 million copies and be translated into more than 60 languages, making him the most translated African author of all time. Its success earned him global recognition, paving the way for his later works like No Longer at Ease, Arrow of God, and A Man of the People. Achebe's literary impact was honored with numerous awards, including the Margaret Wong Memorial Prize, the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, and the Mambuka International Prize for his lifetime. With that kind of impact, you would think a Nobel Prize would be a given, right? Well, not quite. And guess what? Achebe didn't even lose sleep about it. Now let's get into why. Number 1, rejection of Western approval. Chinua Achebe never sought validation from Western institutions. He believed African literature should be judged on its own merit, not through the lens of Western literary standards. Achebe openly criticized the Eurocentric portrayal of Africa in literature, especially in works like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. His refusal to conform to Western literary expectations likely played a role in why the Nobel Committee overlooked him. Number 2, African literature's late recognition. When Achebe published Things Fall Apart in 1958, African literature was still fighting for global recognition. At the time, the Nobel Prize heavily favored Western writers with very few non-European or non-American laureates. It wasn't until 1986, almost 3 decades after Achebe's debut, that Wole Soyinka became the first African to win the Nobel Prize in literature. By then, Achebe had already established himself as a literary giant, but the delay in recognizing African literature meant he was never seriously considered in his prime. Number 3, focus on cultural identity. Achebe's works prioritize African cultural identity, history, and tradition over universal themes that the Nobel Committee often favored. His storytelling was deeply rooted in Igbo proverbs, oral traditions, and African perspectives, which may not have aligned with the Western literary criteria that dominated Nobel selections. 4, preference for storytelling over experimental writing. The Nobel Prize has historically favored writers who push literary boundaries with experimental or avant-garde techniques. Achebe, on the other hand, focused on clear, impactful storytelling that preserved African oral traditions. His straightforward yet profound narrative style, though powerful, may not have fit the committee's preference for highly innovative or complex literary structures. Was Achebe's genius too bold for the Nobel Committee, or did his African storytelling defy their expectations? Stick around to find out. Number 5, he was never in the right circles. Unlike some Nobel laureates who strategically built connections within elite literary circles, Achebe remained firmly rooted in African academia and storytelling. He prioritized authentic African narratives over aligning with Western literary norms, refusing to compromise his cultural perspective for international approval. This steadfast commitment to his heritage may have distanced him from the Western literary establishment, ultimately limiting his chances of receiving the Nobel Prize despite his profound global influence. Number 6, reluctance to campaign for the prize. Achebe never actively sought the Nobel Prize or engaged in the kind of self-promotion many winners do. He believed in the power of his work rather than chasing validation, focusing instead on writing stories that preserved African identity and history. Number 7, anti-colonial themes. Achebe's works boldly confronted colonial narratives, shedding light on the lasting wounds of imperialism in Africa. Through his storytelling, he unapologetically exposed Western exploitation and the erasure of African identity, demanding a reevaluation of history from an African perspective. Given the Nobel Committee's historical Eurocentric leanings, his relentless critique of colonialism may not have aligned with their literary preferences, potentially influencing their decision to overlook him for the prize. Number 8, harsh criticism of Joseph Conrad. Achebe's famous essay An Image of Africa called Joseph Conrad a thoroughgoing racist for his portrayal of Africans in Heart of Darkness. This bold stance sparked controversy in Western literary circles, likely alienating influential critics who held Conrad in high regard. He refused to play by the rules, challenged the icons, and exposed uncomfortable truths. Could that be why he was overlooked? Well, grab a cup of coffee, sit tight, and hang in there for more. Number 9, Western media control. Achebe's global recognition didn't rely on Western media, which plays a crucial role in shaping Nobel Prize narratives. Unlike some laureates who benefited from heavy Western literary promotion, Achebe's influence spread organically through academia, African literature enthusiasts, and grassroots readership. Without Western media actively championing his cause, his name may not have been pushed to the forefront of Nobel considerations. And number 10, he simply didn't care. Achebe was never one to seek validation from Western institutions. He believed in the power of African storytelling and prioritizing writing for his people rather than chasing international accolades. In multiple interviews, he made it clear that the Nobel Prize wasn't his concern. What mattered was telling African stories with authenticity and impact. Whether the Nobel Committee acknowledged him or not, his legacy remains untouchable. And that's the story of why Chinua Achebe never won a Nobel Prize and why he didn't need one. His influence on literature and African storytelling is far greater than any award could define. What do you think? Was he overlooked, or did he simply transcend the need for Western validation? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you love content on literary legends, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. See you next time. Bye.